Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Alberta Centre for Injury Control and Research and the Centre for Suicide Prevention's webinar, The 5 Things We Wish All Teachers Knew About Anxiety, Depression, and Suicide. This is the last of our webinars until the fall. Our next webinar is scheduled for September 24th, but as of yet, we haven't identified our topic for September 24th. So we have been encouraging people while you're waiting for the webinar to start to make any suggestions you have about topics you'd like to hear more about in this type of a format. Everyone is in listen-only mode, so in order to ask questions or provide comments, please feel free to use the chat box feature on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. And the other thing to be aware of is that the webinar is being recorded, and we will make the webinar and the slides available on the Centre for Suicide Prevention's website later on this week. Our speaker today is Dave McLeod. We heard him before, and he tells us all sorts of interesting things and is a very engaging fellow. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Dave is a trainer with the Centre for Suicide Prevention and also a psychologist. Again, if you have questions during the presentation, please note them in the chat box, and there will be an opportunity at the end of Dave's presentation to ask questions as well. So I will just take it away, Dave.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? I want to see all the yeses in the chat box. Okay, there we go. Good, thank you. All right, well, thanks, Patty, for the introduction. Thanks, everybody, for coming and spending some more time with us again to talk about, today, we want to talk about anxiety and depression and young people and suicide. And I thought just as a starting point, before we launch into this, I wanted to show you this quote. You may have seen this. It's a pretty well-known quote by Lao Tzu, who was, of course, the founder of Taoism. I thought this was a pretty good quote for us as an anchor, especially when we're talking about suicide. This whole notion that, I mean, when we talk with suicidal people, one of the things that we so commonly see is that people have come to believe that the way things have been in the past and the way things have become is the way that they must continue to be, this sort of hopeless and helpless kind of feeling. And then he talks more about the anxiety as being a future-focused thing. My definition of anxiety is being worried about things that you can't control. And so the commonality in all of this with suicide is this sense of hopelessness and powerlessness and helplessness to be able to change anything, to improve life. So I wanted to use that as a starting point when we begin talking about the topic of anxiety and depression. Now, first thing to say before we even get talking about anxiety and depression as disorders is that depression and anxiety are normal parts of human experience. We all get depressed, we all get bummed out, we all get dismayed, we all get sad sometimes about some things. And the same thing with anxiety. We all get nervous, we all get worried, we all get edgy, we all get agitated. So what's the point where depression and anxiety stop being normal parts of human experience and start to become a problem? And in my view, it's the point at which they start to take on a life of their own. So in the case of depression, even if things are going well in your life, you still can't feel good. Or in the case of anxiety, often the marker is, you know, maybe I'm worried about something that's coming up and then I don't sleep tonight and then I don't sleep tomorrow. And pretty soon I start becoming anxious about being anxious. I start being anxious about not sleeping or whatever. It's like the symptoms or the problems, the obstacles, start to become an element in and of themselves. We're talking more today about a point where we really do talk about them as disorders, something that's seemed to got some legs, that sticks around and causes a significant kind of an impact in being able to get on with day-to-day life. And one of the first comments to talk about when we put up this slide is that depression and anxiety, there's a huge amount of overlap in the two. It's very common that people who are diagnosed with one get diagnosed with the other. And many of the medications that are commonly used to treat and manage these are active on both. And there's a big area in the center there you could see with lots of overlap to it. The sleep disturbance, the appetite disturbance, and so forth. How prevalent are they? Well, I threw up a table with some numbers, and one of the things that you may notice pretty quickly here is that something that's not in our topic area is another area of disorders, that what are being called impulse control disorders, which realistically, when we're talking about the context of a webinar like this, when we're talking about school systems and young people, largely what we're talking about there is attentional and concentrational problems, ADD, ADHD. And we've got some pretty good research that says that something on the order of about 30 to 40% of people who are diagnosed with attentional problems, with ADD, probably also could be diagnosed with anxiety, especially OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And when you think about that, that's eyebrow raising at the very least. There's something sort of oxymoronic about that, because the attention deficit person doesn't think ahead, and the anxiety person thinks too much ahead. They seem like opposites. And yet, the challenge for the ADD person, for the person with attentional problems, is to attend to what's going on now. And anxiety tends to lead the head, lead the thoughts to the future, to obsess about that, and blocks being able to pay attention to what's going on now. Anxiety creates what I would call head noise. Well, so if we've got quite a bit of this happening, well, one of the statistics that seems to be pretty thoroughly echoed in a lot of jurisdictions is this whole notion that about 15%, so what, about 1 out of 7 Canadian children have some element of mental health concern. Now, whether that's anxiety or depression, attentional problems, or whatever, and whether that's openly identified and diagnosed or not, that's a whole other question. And more importantly, that probably only about a fifth, or maybe not even, of people who have mental health problems are actually getting professional help. Now, whether that be medication or proper, counseling or therapy, again, that's a little less clear as well. But just to do a little bit of sort of basic math, suppose you are teaching in a high school with 1,000 students, just for the sake of simple math here. Now, what that could mean then is that you could have as many as 100 kids in your school who might be struggling with anxiety, a diagnosable anxiety. And you could have something on the order of 50 to 70 of your students struggling with depression. Now, whether you get to know that or not, whether that's openly identified or not, that's a whole other problem. We're going to get to that in a minute. Both are more common in girls and boys, and both seem to be increasing, or at least, at the very least, our awareness of them seem to be increasing. There's some indication that it's not just that we're more aware of the problem, but there really is more of the problem. So, when we start then knowing that there's a fair amount of of depression and anxiety present in the schools, one of the things that we need to want to try to do right off the hop is to be able to recognize them. And I put up a chart here where you'll notice on the left side that all those kinds of signs or symptoms or whatever we want to call those indicators. That's a more classic kind of an adult or a stereotypical kind of an idea of what a depressed person looks like. This low energy, low interest, wanting to sleep a lot or can't sleep at all. Food doesn't taste good, don't want to eat, either that or eating all the time. No energy, no interest. With adolescence, depression can look somewhat different. And the couple of key words in here, one of them is change, that we look for changes in behavior. You may see all of that lowered kind of energy in the isolation and withdrawal. You may see all of that. That's not unusual. But sometimes we also see more angry, acting out, desperate, rash kind of behavior, risky behavior, Russian roulette behavior. It's driving the car out on the frozen lake. It's behaving in a way where there's a tolerance for the possibility that I might die. And we often see agitation and anger coming out. And a big word that we always want to pay attention to is that word impulsivity. There's lots of indication in research and anecdotal stories where adolescents are more likely to make a decision to suicide in a fairly quick kind of process rather than slowly arriving at that decision. And then what about anxiety? It would be a big mistake to talk about anxiety as if it's only one kind of a presentation. There's many different ways that anxiety can play out. if you have young children in preschool or elementary school age, or even early elementary school up to, say, age 7, who are refusing to go to school, don't want to go to school, don't want to let go of, dad's pant leg or whatever, a separation anxiety disorder, that would be quite a common thing. Beyond age 7, I think you got a problem if that's starting to happen there. Social anxiety disorder, we don't need to spend a lot of time on these, I don't imagine. I think you probably have a sense of what a lot of these are about. But just being sort of, not wanting to be around other people, being frightened of how I'm going to be seen or that I'm going to be criticized. Obsessive compulsive disorder, we could talk for a long time about that. But one interesting thing about obsessive compulsive disorder is that the obsessive part is the thinking, the worrying part. That's the thoughts. The compulsive part, though, is the behavior that comes afterwards, where a person is doing something deliberately in order to try to reduce the anxiety. It's a functional, deliberate behavior. I'm going to make another comment about that in a minute. Panic disorder, you could see where kids are not wanting to go into a classroom because they're standing outside in a cold sweat. Generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Let me tell you quickly a story about that. Kind of an interesting story, and it starts out by me saying that, first of all, I'm speaking to you from Calgary, which we know is the third most ethnically diverse city in Canada. So how applicable this would be to all of you in your settings, I'm not sure. But there's a concept in this story that I think is pretty interesting for us to bear in mind. And that is a story that took place a couple of months back, and it was in a junior high school in Calgary, where they decided they were going to do a simulated lockdown, a practice, a drill, so that students would know what to do, to close the doors and get under the desks and so forth. And it turns out that in this particular school, there were a couple of students who are Sudanese from refugee families who had seen their parents shot and killed in civil war in South Sudan. And the simple fact of creating a simulation of a lockdown threw them into a frozen state of panic. I guess the concept in this whole thing is that everybody's got their stories and everybody has their potential for reactions with anxiety, whatever that might be, test anxiety, specific phobias, things like that. So that leads to this next slide that I really wanted to make an important point about. And that is that the student who is anxious or the student who is depressed is probably not the student who's loud and in your face. The student who is anxious and depressed tends to avoid and pull back and get out of the mainstream. They hide. And so it can be hard for us to reach them. Sometimes hard for us to recognize who is anxious and who is depressed. Just advance a slide here. The third fact, I think, is one that I'm going to guess you already would have arrived at some point earlier on in this process, and that's to understand that there is a higher suicide risk rate for students, for people who are experiencing depression and anxiety as well. Now, with depression, it's much, much higher. With anxiety, a little bit higher. Now, how that helps us in a minute, I'll tell you about that. But this, I thought, was an interesting thing to throw in on the way by. For people who have an obsessive compulsive disorder, they actually have a lower suicide risk or suicide rates than an average population. And when you think about it, it kind of makes some sense. If you think of a depressed person, a suicidal person, according to that stereotypical design that we showed you a while back, of low energy, low interest, kind of giving up and withdrawing and pulling back. Well, in the case of the obsessive compulsive, I talked about how the compulsive behavior, it's deliberately intended to try to change things, to bring about change. Even though it's misguided, it's meant to get rid of the anxiety. It's functional, it's purposeful, there's tons of energy. It's just misdirected. So it's not a giving up. In fact, it's an excessive kind of over-response that does that. So it's pretty interesting that people with OCD actually have lower suicide rates. Well, okay, one other comment to make about the whole prevalence of this. Well, I guess it's important to understand that not everyone who is depressed will suicide. And not everyone who suicides is depressed. But there is a huge element of overlap there. We have estimates that say at least 60%, probably closer to 80%. I've seen estimates even as high as 90% that say it's 80% of people who suicide probably could be diagnosed with depression. And then the flip side of that, of people who are depressed, something on the order of about a fifth of them, 20% or so, may take some action towards suicide. So those are worrisome numbers. It's particularly depression connection to suicide that we're particularly concerned about. All right, so we really wanted to save some time to get to the last part of this, because this is really where this becomes most practical, and that's the whole idea of what we can do to try to help people who are depressed and anxious with respect to preventing suicide. Starting with depression, although we're going to say the same thing in a second about anxiety, that being able to recognize it, spot it, be vigilant about it is an important starting point. I said earlier that people who are depressed, people who are anxious, tend not to come into our daily kind of presence as teachers or as adults in the school system. They're not the loud, in-your-face kind of kids. And so if you're thinking that the anxiety kid is the kid who is trying to get the 95 average so he can get into McGill and is arguing all the time about the marks that he didn't get instead of the marks that he did get, it's very easy to get sucked into a sort of defining that as anxiety, when really some of the kids that are struggling the most with anxiety are the kids that you don't see. If you see kids, by the way, pulling out of their social circle, much of their social circle and social interaction takes place online. If you see kids shutting down their Facebook pages, that would be such an unusual thing. You start to become quite worried about that. Is there bullying going on? Are they just wanting to close off their connections with other people? As far as anxiety goes, you would have some ideas already of what kinds of things you want to be paying attention to. Have you got kids that just are refusing to go to school, preschool? They're avoiding eye contact when they get there. They won't speak, elective mutism. They don't even want to raise their hand in class. They won't eat in the cafeteria. They leave the school grounds all by themselves. So first of all, their challenge is to recognize it. And then once it's been identified, and first of all, it's generally a useful thing in a sensitive and careful way to be able to put words to it, to name it, to identify it openly, to free the student up, to talk about it. This may be also a place where other staff within the school might play some role in this. Parents, of course, there's an opportunity to engage parents. Anyway, one of the things as adults, as teachers, that we want to try to do is be sensitive to the idea that students, especially in the case of anxiety, they look like they're not following instructions a lot of the time. They're not making the transitions from class to class in a timely way. One of the things I want to see if I can describe for you is how this can play out sometimes with let's suppose that you're a teacher, and here's Patty's on the screen here with me. Let's suppose that Patty and I are two students in your class, and you give an assignment out that says you need to work in pairs to work on such and such a project. And so we get paired together. So I've got a social anxiety, a fear of talking to other people, of being around other people. So Patty and I get together, and Patty says, okay, I've got all these ideas of what we should do. I think we should do this thing, and we could try this, and we could work on that. What do you think? And I say almost nothing, because I'm afraid, because I'm really timid, and I'm really shy. And Patty starts to feel like she has to do all the work, not necessarily all the work on the project, but all the work in getting conversation going, because I'm not responding. And I believe that all of us use ourselves as a reference point for what is normal. So if I can talk to you, then you should be able to talk to me. So Patty's thinking to herself, it's not that I can't talk, it's that I won't. I'm just being miserable, or I'm aloof. And so we finish our meeting, and then she goes off and talks to her friends, and she says, boy, did I ever get a dud of a partner on that. This guy's just a jerk. He won't talk, and he won't do anything, and he's lazy, and he's selfish. So now I've got a stigma that started out just from me being shy. what looked like, or what started out as a problem that I can't meet my responsibilities now looks like somebody who won't meet responsibilities. And this is an important point I think we want to pay attention to as teachers and as adults. It's so easy to get sucked over to the side of this is somebody who won't. This is deliberate, oppositional, resistant behavior. When very often these are students who can't. They're doing the only thing they know how to do. And why that's important is because can't and won't lead us in two very different directions. If somebody can't meet their responsibilities, then as a society generally, we go to the wall to try to help them, to teach them, to treat them, to educate them. People who won't, all you can do is hold them accountable for the choices that they make. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Now, there are other kinds of things that can be done in terms of actual strategies. We tend to try to move, especially in social anxieties and confidence problems, test anxiety, we try to move from less threatening to more threatening kind of situations. Easier to have students, by show of hands, how many people in the class would support this idea is a much less threatening starting point than having to stand up and speak out or go to the board and solve something on the whiteboard, a math problem or whatever. So we gradually try to build that up, working in smaller groups. And then there's a whole area of accommodations, and you will all know the accommodations that are available within your school systems. They differ from one jurisdiction to the next. One important point, though, is as much as you can get them established in the grade school years, then they can be carried over into post-secondary, where I'm led to believe that most post-secondaries won't start something up if it hasn't already been established in the grade school years. So it's particularly important to do that. And by the way, accommodations, talk about anxiety and depression, just about all of our accommodations are for anxiety. There's not very many accommodations that tend to show up with respect to depression. Kind of interesting, but extra time on tests and being able to write your tests in a private place or something. Last couple of things and that I wanted to let you know about. First of all, this whole notion with depression, I'll draw attention to the exercise. There's this common thought that says, when I feel better, I'll get active. Not realizing that it's the other way around. When I get active, then I start to feel better. And I'll draw your attention also to the last element on this page. Sometimes when people are getting low and depressed and seem to be struggling a lot, every now and again you'll see something happen where there'll be a sudden kind of burst of mood, of positive energy. And normally, that's exactly what we want to see happen. We want to see people getting gradually feeling better and getting more energy, more positive, happier. But sometimes a sudden kind of improvement happens because people have been struggling with the question of suicide. And finally, when they make the decision, then there's like a relief and a release that takes place. And they suddenly get a little burst of energy as they put their affairs in order. So even though we generally like to see that and relax and exhale for the first time in a long time, that's a time when we want to try to pay more attention just for now to make sure that there really is genuine improvement here. And then just a last kind of a general comment is that as much as possible, we want to see if we can foster a general sort of an understanding even within the larger school setting, the larger community, among other young people, as much as they're able to learn about depression and anxiety and the ways these things can play out, then they can be more accepting and sensitive to one another, and also recognizing when children are isolating themselves, when young people are off, on their own or whatever, they may be better able to pick it up even than we can as adults. That's the essence of what I wanted to talk to you about. There, I put up one last slide for you with some references where a number of the statistics came from today's presentation, and one that I'll suggest it would be time well spent to go and look at is the second one from the bottom, School and Classroom Strategies, Anxiety. If you have anxious students in your circle, have a look at that. It's an excellent list of all kinds of different, very practical kinds of strategies that you can use within your school setting to try to help other young people. Now, I know I froze. That was not a panic attack, by the way. That was a tech attack. But if you've got some questions, even though I'm a disembodied voice right now, I'll see if I can help you with whatever's on your mind.
Thanks, Dave. So does anybody have any questions, comments, resources, or programs that they're aware of or using in their schools that they're finding useful to build supportive environments around anxiety and depression? Pretty quiet out there, Dave.
I think so.
Okay, so Suggestion for Anxiety BC has a great website as well as an app for smartphones. We'll find that link and share it. Okay, another interesting tribes method for teaching which builds inclusion. Thanks, Nancy. The app is called Mind. Any other questions, comments? Mental health spirit days. Lots of good ideas. So the Center for Suicide Prevention is an excellent resource for finding out where you can locate assist training in your communities. Great. Suraria, where are you from? In from the cold. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Dave, a request from a community for resource support for an elementary school for children who return to school after losing a loved one to suicide. Any suggestions?
I don't have anything. That's Laura Lee. I don't have anything off the top of my head, but there is a toolkit that's available through the Center for Suicide Prevention after a suicide. Have a look at that, and then if there's still more specific kind of need there, contact us at the Center for Suicide Prevention. We'll see if we can dig something up that's a little more specific to your situation. Is that fair?
So, Dave, do you want to just share a general email address?
Yeah, what is the email address? Suicideinfo.ca.
Great.
CSP at suicideinfo.ca. I'm sure you can get at it from the website.
Yes. I'm just testing you.
I think I failed. Test anxiety.
You never email yourself.
No, that's true.
Great. I see somebody did suggest a book called Dinosaurs Die, and sometimes funeral homes have some good resources as well. Any other questions or comments?
And while some of you are still, I see a question from Kirk. I'll get to that in a second. Just while we're doing this, again, I'd remind you when we've got the chat box open like this, it's a good opportunity if there are some other topics that you would like us to try to address through webinars coming up in the fall. This would be a good chance to let us know. Okay, Kirk wants to know what are the top causes of anxiety and depression? How long do we have? Till Friday? Well, where to begin with that? With young people, for sure. Let's start with anxieties. Well, with both. there's lots of research that's saying there's probably something chemical in a lot of situations. It makes sense to talk about, you know, the professionals sometimes make a distinction between state and trait depressions or state and trait anxieties. In other words, sometimes these are situational reactions to things that are going on in my life. And sometimes there's something more body-based, a predisposition. What kinds of things could be causing that in the school? Oh gosh, we could, among our chat window, we could brainstorm and fill the chat window, and it would take us an hour to do it. Lots of times, social concerns, social relational things, families. Sometimes, common kind of a predisposed or a precursor to suicide. You find elements of loss, significant loss of important relationships, loss of safety, loss of health, and the anxieties. I mean, there's many different forms that could come out. So I feel like it's such a big question. I'm not doing a very good job of answering this, but.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Any other questions? Comment about seeing lots of self-harm issues in Claudine's area?
I assume that is a suggestion that we could do more stuff in a webinar around self-harm. Yes, okay. And to Mr. or Ms. Laboucaine, we're seeing it more here. Where? Where's your area? Oh, Slave Lake. Oh, Brenda, okay.
Okay, so I think it looks like that's it probably for questions. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to remind everybody that we will be sending out a survey to all of the attendees, looking for feedback both about the webinar itself, ideas for new webinars, and also we use the results that you provide to us as part of our report back to our funders. So if our funder likes our report, hopefully they will fund us for another round of webinars in the fall. So please do take a minute to fill out the survey when it comes. It's online, so it's only a few minutes. As well, it'll help us plan our session for the fall too, in terms of focusing it on self-harm and some other topics. So that's really great. If you are not receiving our announcements when the webinars are set up and registration is open, please let me know here at ACICR, Patty, or the Center for Suicide Prevention, and we'll make sure you get on one of our distribution lists. And thank you to everyone. Thanks to all of you at the Center for Suicide Prevention, and I hope everybody has a great summer.
Okay. Thank you, Patty.
Okay, good night.